The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Renaissance Florence as Lorenzo de' Medici made his way through the bustling marketplace. The year was 1513, and the political landscape of Italy resembled a chessboard where kings fell as quickly as they rose. In a modest dwelling not far from the Ponte Vecchio, a disgraced diplomat named Niccolò Machiavelli sat hunched over his desk, quill in hand, wrestling with ideas that would forever change how humanity understood power, virtue, and the terrible paradox that lay between them. Machiavelli had witnessed firsthand the collapse of the Florentine Republic, had seen virtuous leaders destroyed by their own nobility, and had observed how those who succeeded in maintaining power often did so through means that would make saints weep. As he penned what would become The Prince, he was not merely writing a handbook for rulers, he was unveiling a profound and disturbing truth about the nature of virtue itself. The very qualities that made individuals admirable in private life, he realized, could prove catastrophic when applied to statecraft. This insight would ripple through centuries, challenging every comfortable assumption about morality, leadership, and the price of maintaining civilization. The traditional understanding of virtue, inherited from classical antiquity and refined by Christian theology, painted a picture of moral excellence that seemed as clear as mountain spring water. Virtue meant courage, honesty, compassion, justice, and temperance. The virtuous person was one who embodied these qualities consistently, regardless of circumstances. Aristotle had taught that virtue was the golden mean between extremes, while Christian thinkers had elevated virtues like humility, charity, and forgiveness to the highest pedestals of human achievement. Yet as Machiavelli observed the political theater of his time, he began to notice a disturbing pattern. The most virtuous rulers often suffered the most spectacular downfalls, while those willing to employ deception, violence, and manipulation seemed to thrive. The Duke of Milan might speak eloquently about justice while his armies ravaged the countryside. The Pope might preach about Christian charity while engaging in brutal power struggles that left thousands dead. Meanwhile, leaders who genuinely attempted to govern according to classical virtues found themselves outmaneuvered, betrayed, and ultimately destroyed by those with fewer moral qualms. Consider the case of Piero Soderini, the gonfalonier of Florence whom Machiavelli served. Soderini was, by all accounts, a man of genuine virtue in the classical sense. He was honest, compassionate, and committed to justice. He believed in the power of reason and moral persuasion to resolve conflicts. When faced with threats to the Republic, he consistently chose the path that seemed most ethical, most in line with traditional notions of virtuous leadership. He avoided violence when possible, honored treaties even when they became disadvantageous, and treated his enemies with a fairness that bordered on naivety. The result was catastrophic. Soderini's virtue became his undoing, and, with it, the freedom of Florence itself. More ruthless opponents exploited his unwillingness to employ harsh measures, his commitment to fairness was interpreted as weakness, and his moral consistency became a predictable pattern that enemies could manipulate. In 1512, the Medici returned to power, the Republic fell, and Soderini fled into exile. The very virtues that made him admirable as a human being had rendered him ineffective as a leader, and his failure had consequences far beyond his own fate. This observation led Machiavelli to a revolutionary insight that would scandalize generations of readers. Virtue, as traditionally understood, was not merely inadequate for political leadership, it was actively dangerous. The prince who insisted on always telling the truth would find himself surrounded by liars. The ruler who refused to employ violence would be conquered by those who embraced it. The leader who always kept his word would be destroyed by those who broke theirs whenever convenient. Traditional virtue, when practiced in the realm of politics, became a form of unilateral disarmament that invited exploitation and ultimately threatened the very survival of the state. But Machiavelli's insight went deeper than simple pragmatic observation. He recognized that the consequences of virtuous failure in politics extended far beyond the ruler himself. When a virtuous prince fell due to his unwillingness to employ necessary but morally questionable means, the result was often chaos, suffering, and the triumph of far worse evils. The collapse of a state led by a virtuous but ineffective ruler typically resulted in civil war, foreign invasion, or the rise of tyrants far more brutal than anything the original virtuous leader might have contemplated. This created what Machiavelli saw as a profound moral paradox. The prince who allowed his kingdom to fall into chaos because he refused to employ harsh measures was, in effect, responsible for far greater suffering than the prince who used limited cruelty to maintain order. The virtue that seemed so admirable in theory became, in practice, a form of moral irresponsibility that prioritized the leader's personal moral purity over the welfare of his subjects. Take the example of a prince faced with a rebellion that threatens to plunge his state into civil war. The traditionally virtuous response might be to attempt negotiation, to show mercy to captured rebels, and to address their grievances through peaceful means. This approach certainly aligns with classical notions of virtue. It demonstrates compassion, justice, and a commitment to peaceful resolution. However, if this approach fails to quell the rebellion and, instead, emboldens other potential rebels, the result might be a devastating civil war that destroys the kingdom and causes immense suffering to innocent civilians. Alternatively, the prince might choose to crush the rebellion swiftly and brutally, making an example of the rebels that discourages future uprisings. This approach violates traditional notions of virtue. It involves cruelty, violence, and a willingness to prioritize results over moral purity. Yet if it successfully prevents a larger conflict and maintains the peace that allows commerce, culture, and civilization to flourish, which approach is truly more virtuous? Machiavelli argued that the second prince, despite his apparent cruelty, actually serves virtue better by accepting moral responsibility for harsh but necessary actions. This insight revealed what Machiavelli saw as a fundamental flaw in traditional virtue ethics. Classical virtue was designed for private life, for individuals operating within stable social structures where moral consistency could be maintained without catastrophic consequences. But political leadership operated in a different realm entirely, one where the stakes were higher, the enemies more ruthless, and the luxury of moral purity often unaffordable. The leader who insisted on applying private virtue to public responsibility was like a doctor who refused to amputate a gangrenous limb because cutting was wrong. His moral purity might preserve his conscience, but it would kill his patient. The first part of Machiavelli's dark insight thus concerned the surprising consequences of traditional virtue when applied to political leadership. Virtue, pursued with rigid consistency, could become a vice that destroyed the very things it claimed to protect. The honest prince might lose his kingdom to liars, leaving his subjects at the mercy of corruption. The merciful prince might allow criminals to terrorize the innocent, making mercy itself a form of cruelty. The peaceful prince might invite aggression that ultimately caused more violence than decisive action might have prevented. But Machiavelli's analysis didn't stop with this observation. He pushed deeper, examining not just how traditional virtue failed in politics, but why it failed, and what this revealed about the nature of virtue itself. What he discovered was even more disturbing. The very structure of virtue as traditionally conceived contained inherent contradictions that made its consistent application impossible in many real-world situations. The deeper Machiavelli delved into his analysis, the more he realized that the problem with virtue extended beyond mere political expediency. The traditional conception of virtue contained internal contradictions that made its consistent application not just difficult, but logically impossible in many situations. This discovery would form the second part of his revolutionary insight, that virtue itself was far more complex and problematic than classical philosophy had acknowledged. Consider the virtue of justice, long held as one of the cardinal virtues by both classical and Christian traditions. Justice demands that we give each person their due, that we treat equals equally, and that we punish wrongdoing while rewarding virtue. Yet what happens when these demands conflict with one another? Machiavelli had witnessed countless situations where the demands of justice pulled in opposite directions, creating impossible moral dilemmas that no amount of philosophical reasoning could resolve. A prince discovers that his most trusted advisor has been secretly negotiating with enemy forces, sharing military secrets that have already led to the deaths of hundreds of soldiers. Justice demands severe punishment, perhaps execution, for such treachery. Yet this same advisor has a family, including young children who would be left destitute by his death. Moreover, the advisor's information has been largely obsolete, and his motivation was not personal gain but a sincere belief that peace could be achieved through secret negotiations. Justice for the dead soldiers points toward harsh punishment, justice for the advisor's family and consideration of his motives points toward mercy. Justice as consistency requires that treachery be punished regardless of circumstances or consequences. Which path serves justice? The traditional answer might be that wisdom could discern the truly just course, but Machiavelli recognized this as philosophical sleight of hand. The reality was that justice itself demanded contradictory actions. Any choice the prince made would violate some aspect of justice while serving another. The virtue that was supposed to guide action had become a source of paralysis, offering no clear direction when direction was most needed. The same contradictions appeared in every classical virtue. Courage might demand standing firm against overwhelming odds to inspire one's troops, but it might also demand a strategic retreat to preserve lives for a future battle. Honesty might require telling a truth that would destroy morale and lead to defeat, while the lie that preserved hope might ultimately save more lives and serve a greater truth. Temperance might counsel moderation in all things, but there were moments when only extreme action could prevent catastrophe. Machiavelli began to see that the classical virtues had been designed for a world that didn't exist, a world where moral choices were clear, where virtue always aligned with beneficial outcomes, and where good intentions necessarily led to good results. But the real world was messier, more complex, and far more morally ambiguous than classical philosophy had acknowledged. In the real world, virtue often conflicted with virtue, good intentions led to terrible outcomes, and moral purity could become a form of moral irresponsibility. This realization led Machiavelli to question not just specific virtues, but the entire framework of virtue ethics itself. The classical approach assumed that virtue could be defined independently of consequences, that certain actions or character traits were inherently good regardless of their results. But Machiavelli's observations suggested that this approach was fundamentally flawed. How could an action be truly virtuous if it led to outcomes that contradicted the very purposes virtue was supposed to serve? The prince who maintained his honesty while his kingdom collapsed into chaos might preserve his personal moral purity, but could such an outcome really be called virtuous? The ruler who kept his promises while his people suffered under the agreements he refused to break might satisfy abstract moral principles, but did this serve any meaningful conception of good? Machiavelli increasingly concluded that virtue divorced from consequences was not virtue at all, but a form of moral masturbation that prioritized the actor's psychological comfort over any genuine good in the world. This insight forced him to confront an even more fundamental question: what was virtue actually for? The classical tradition offered various answers. Virtue was for its own sake, virtue aligned us with cosmic order, virtue reflected divine command, virtue enabled human flourishing. But, when Machiavelli examined these justifications in light of real-world experience, they began to crumble. A virtue that was valuable for its own sake but led to terrible consequences seemed to serve no one except the virtue holder's ego. A virtue that aligned with cosmic order while creating chaos on earth appeared to misunderstand either the cosmos or its alignment. A virtue that reflected divine command while producing results that any decent God would condemn raised serious questions about the source of those commands. The most promising justification, that virtue enabled human flourishing, seemed closest to Machiavelli's observations, but it required a radical reconceptualization of what virtue meant. If virtue was truly about enabling human flourishing, then virtue had to be judged by its results, not its intentions or its compliance with abstract principles. A truly virtuous action would be one that genuinely promoted human welfare, even if it violated traditional moral rules. A truly virtuous ruler would be one who created conditions for his people to thrive, even if he employed means that classical virtue would condemn. This approach led to what modern scholars call dirty hands problems, situations where achieving genuinely good outcomes required employing means that were, by traditional standards, morally questionable or even reprehensible. The ruler who ordered the execution of conspirators to prevent a civil war was getting his hands dirty, but he might be serving virtue in a deeper sense by preventing far greater suffering. The diplomat who lied to enemy negotiators to secure a peace treaty was violating honesty, but he might be serving a higher honesty by creating conditions for truth to flourish in peacetime. Machiavelli recognized that this reconceptualization of virtue was dangerous. It could easily become a justification for any atrocity, a way of rationalizing evil by claiming it served some greater good. The prince who claimed to torture prisoners for the greater good of state security, the official who claimed to steal public funds to prevent economic collapse, the general who claimed to massacre civilians to shorten a war, all could invoke this logic to justify their actions. The path from recognizing the complexity of virtue to abandoning virtue entirely was disturbingly short. Yet Machiavelli also recognized that the alternative, rigid adherence to traditional virtue regardless of consequences, was equally dangerous and, arguably, more irresponsible. The prince who allowed thousands to die because he refused to dirty his hands with necessary violence was not more virtuous than the prince who accepted moral responsibility for harsh but effective action. The official who maintained his personal honesty while corruption destroyed his government was not serving honesty in any meaningful sense. The general who followed rules of war while his enemies committed atrocities that prolonged conflict was not serving peace or humanity. The key insight was that virtue had to be understood as something more complex than simple rule following or character trait cultivation. True virtue required wisdom to recognize when traditional virtues conflicted with each other or with their own deeper purposes. It required courage to accept moral responsibility for necessary but distasteful actions. It required humility to acknowledge that moral purity might sometimes be a luxury that leaders could not afford. And, perhaps most importantly, it required a clear understanding of what virtue was ultimately supposed to achieve. Machiavelli's analysis of virtue's internal contradictions revealed that the classical conception of virtue was not just inadequate for political leadership, but philosophically incoherent. Virtue could not be both absolute and practical, both universal and contextual, both rule-based and outcome-oriented. The attempt to maintain these contradictory requirements led to the moral paralysis that Machiavelli observed in many well-intentioned but ineffective leaders. This philosophical critique had profound implications that extended far beyond political theory. If virtue itself was more complex and contradictory than previously understood, then entire systems of moral reasoning needed to be reconsidered. The comfortable certainties of classical and Christian ethics gave way to a more troubling but more honest recognition of moral ambiguity. Good people could disagree about what virtue required not because they had different values, but because virtue itself demanded contradictory things. Moral choices became exercises in judgment rather than applications of rules, and moral responsibility expanded to include accountability for consequences as well as intentions. The second part of Machiavelli's insight thus revealed that the surprising consequences of virtue were not accidental byproducts of an otherwise sound moral system, but inevitable results of deep philosophical problems within virtue ethics itself. Traditional virtue was not just poorly suited to political leadership, it was internally contradictory in ways that made consistent application impossible in any complex moral situation. The recognition of this internal contradiction was perhaps even more disturbing than the original observation about virtue's political inadequacy, because it suggested that the problem was not with how virtue was applied, but with how it was conceived. As Machiavelli's understanding of virtue's contradictions deepened, he began to glimpse the most unsettling aspect of his insight. The problems with traditional virtue were not merely philosophical curiosities or political inconveniences, they revealed something profound and disturbing about the human condition itself. The third and most revolutionary part of his analysis concerned what these surprising consequences of virtue revealed about the nature of human society, moral progress, and the terrible prices that civilization required. Human beings, Machiavelli observed, were not naturally virtuous in the classical sense. Left to their own devices, they tended toward selfishness, short-sightedness, and violence. The order and prosperity that allowed virtue to flourish in private life did not arise spontaneously from human nature, it had to be created and maintained through the application of force, manipulation, and other means that classical virtue would condemn. The very foundation of civilized life rested upon a kind of moral contradiction. Virtue could only flourish in a context created and maintained by actions that virtue itself would prohibit. Consider the establishment of any successful state or civilization. Invariably, it began with violence, the conquest of territory, the subjugation of rival groups, the establishment of dominance through force or the threat of force. The founders of great civilizations were rarely paragons of classical virtue. Romulus murdered his brother Remus. Moses ordered the massacre of those who worshipped the golden calf. The American founding fathers participated in a system of slavery while crafting documents about human equality. These acts violated fundamental principles of classical virtue: justice, mercy, honesty, and respect for human life. Yet without these morally questionable foundations, the civilizations that later allowed virtue to flourish might never have existed. The same pattern repeated throughout history. The Renaissance that produced such flowering of art, culture, and humanistic values was funded by banking practices that the Church condemned as usury, maintained by political arrangements that required constant deception and violence, and built upon economic systems that exploited the poor and powerless. The Enlightenment that gave birth to modern concepts of human rights emerged from societies that practiced slavery, colonialism, and religious persecution. The democratic ideals that modern virtue celebrates were established and maintained by men who denied those same rights to women, minorities, and the propertyless. Machiavelli began to see a disturbing pattern. Every great achievement of human civilization seemed to require moral compromises that classical virtue would condemn. The peace that allowed philosophers to contemplate virtue was maintained by soldiers willing to commit violence. The prosperity that enabled charitable giving was created by merchants willing to exploit advantageous deals and economic inequalities. The stability that permitted justice to function was established by rulers willing to employ harsh measures against those who threatened order. This observation led to what may be Machiavelli's most profound and troubling insight: virtue as traditionally conceived was parasitic upon systems that virtue itself would condemn. The private virtues that classical philosophy celebrated, honesty, compassion, justice, temperance, could only be practiced consistently within social structures that were created and maintained through means that violated those same virtues. The virtuous individual was able to maintain his moral purity only because others were willing to dirty their hands with the necessary but morally questionable work of maintaining civilization. The implications of this insight were staggering. It suggested that moral purity was not just politically ineffective, but socially irresponsible, a luxury that could only be afforded by those who benefited from others' willingness to compromise their virtue for the greater good. The saint who maintained perfect virtue while living within a society maintained by violence and exploitation was not more virtuous than the ruler who accepted moral responsibility for that violence and exploitation. In fact, the saint's virtue was made possible by the ruler's sin, making the saint complicit in the very moral compromises he claimed to transcend. This raised profound questions about the nature of moral progress itself. If virtue required the foundation of civilization, and if civilization required morally questionable means to establish and maintain, then moral progress was not a simple ascent from vice to virtue, but a complex dance of moral trade-offs and compromises. The development of higher forms of virtue depended upon the acceptance of lower forms of vice. The cultivation of refined moral sensibilities required the protection of crude but effective power structures. Machiavelli's analysis suggested that there were really two kinds of virtue operating in human society: the obvious virtue practiced by private individuals within stable social structures, and the hidden virtue practiced by those responsible for creating and maintaining those structures. The first kind of virtue was visible, celebrated, and morally comfortable. The second kind was hidden, condemned, and morally agonizing. Yet the second enabled the first, making it not just politically necessary but morally superior in its willingness to accept responsibility for the full range of human needs. This insight had implications that reached far beyond political theory into fundamental questions of ethics, responsibility, and human nature. If civilization required moral compromise, then the pursuit of moral purity became a form of free riding on others' willingness to accept moral responsibility. The individual who maintained perfect honesty while benefiting from a legal system that relied on police willing to use deception and violence was not more virtuous than the police officer who dirtied his hands to maintain order. The citizen who practiced perfect charity while living in a nation whose prosperity depended on international policies that sometimes harmed other countries was not more virtuous than the diplomat who made those morally complex policy decisions. The recognition of this dynamic fundamentally challenged traditional approaches to moral evaluation. Instead of judging actions or character traits in isolation, Machiavelli's insight demanded that moral evaluation consider the full context of social responsibility and mutual dependence. The ruler who employed harsh measures to maintain peace could not be condemned without also condemning those who benefited from that peace. The merchant who exploited favorable trade agreements could not be criticized without also criticizing those who enjoyed the prosperity those agreements created. This approach to moral evaluation was uncomfortable because it implicated everyone in the moral compromises necessary for civilized life. It suggested that moral purity was largely illusory, a kind of willful blindness to the moral costs of the benefits one enjoyed. The truly virtuous person would not be the one who maintained perfect compliance with traditional moral rules, but the one who honestly acknowledged the full range of moral costs and benefits in their life and accepted appropriate responsibility for both. But Machiavelli's insight went even deeper than this challenge to individual moral evaluation. It suggested that the very nature of human society created systematic moral problems that no amount of individual virtue could solve. The competition between groups, whether tribes, nations, or civilizations, created situations where moral compromise was not just expedient but necessary for survival. The group that maintained perfect virtue while its enemies employed harsh but effective tactics would simply be conquered and destroyed, taking its virtues with it. The civilization that refused to dirty its hands while other civilizations built their power through morally questionable means would find itself dominated by those less scrupulous civilizations. This created what modern scholars might call a virtue trap, a situation where the individual pursuit of virtue could undermine the very conditions that allowed virtue to exist. The prince who maintained perfect honesty while ruling a kingdom surrounded by deceptive neighbors would likely lose his kingdom, and, with it, any chance for honest government to survive. The nation that practiced perfect pacifism while living in a world of aggressive powers would likely be conquered, and, with it, any chance for pacifist values to influence world affairs. The virtue trap revealed a fundamental tension between moral idealism and moral responsibility. The idealist pursued virtue regardless of consequences, maintaining moral purity even if it led to the destruction of everything he claimed to value. The person of responsibility pursued outcomes that served virtue's deeper purposes, even if it required violating virtue's surface rules. Machiavelli increasingly concluded that the person of responsibility was more truly virtuous than the idealist, because responsibility required a more complete and more honest engagement with the full range of moral demands. Yet this conclusion created its own dangers. If virtue could be served by violating traditional moral rules, how could one distinguish between genuine moral responsibility and mere rationalization of evil? If the maintenance of civilization required moral compromise, how could one prevent that compromise from becoming corruption? If virtue traps made traditional virtue politically dangerous, how could one prevent the abandonment of virtue altogether? Machiavelli recognized these dangers but saw no easy answers. The classical tradition offered the false comfort of moral certainty at the price of practical irrelevance and philosophical incoherence. The abandonment of virtue offered practical effectiveness at the price of moral drift and eventual corruption. Neither alternative adequately addressed the genuine complexity of moral life in a world where virtue and necessity often conflicted. The third part of Machiavelli's insight thus revealed that the surprising consequences of virtue pointed toward fundamental problems in the human condition itself. Virtue as traditionally conceived was not just politically inadequate and philosophically incoherent, it was systematically undermined by the very social conditions it claimed to serve. The attempt to maintain traditional virtue in a complex world created virtue traps that could destroy the possibility of virtue altogether. Yet the abandonment of virtue created different dangers that were equally threatening to human flourishing. Machiavelli's dark insight suggested that moral life was far more tragic and complex than either classical philosophy or Christian theology had acknowledged. Virtue required sacrificing virtue, morality demanded immorality, and the good life could only be built upon foundations that the good life itself would condemn. This was not a temporary problem that could be solved through better philosophy or greater moral effort, it was a permanent feature of the human condition that had to be acknowledged and managed rather than transcended. The full implications of this insight would ripple through centuries of political and moral thought, challenging every comfortable assumption about ethics, responsibility, and the possibility of moral progress. Those who grasped Machiavelli's insight found themselves inhabiting a world that was morally darker and more complex than they had imagined, but also more honest and more genuinely responsive to the full range of human needs. The surprising consequences of virtue had revealed not just the inadequacy of traditional moral systems, but the tragic nature of moral life itself, a recognition that would prove both liberating and deeply unsettling for anyone willing to confront its implications. In the end, Machiavelli's analysis of virtue's surprising consequences offered no easy consolations or simple solutions. Instead, it demanded a more mature and more honest engagement with the moral dimensions of human existence. It required abandoning the comfortable fiction that virtue was simple and straightforward in favor of recognizing its genuine complexity and internal contradictions. It meant accepting responsibility not just for one's own actions, but for the full range of consequences that flowed from those actions and the social systems they supported or undermined. Most fundamentally, it meant acknowledging that moral life was not a quest for purity or perfection, but an ongoing struggle to balance competing demands and values in a world that rarely offered clear or comfortable choices. The surprising consequences of virtue revealed that virtue itself was surprising, not the simple, stable foundation for human flourishing that classical philosophy had promised, but a complex, dynamic, and often contradictory set of demands that required wisdom, courage, and humility to navigate effectively. This recognition did not eliminate the importance of virtue or moral striving. Instead, it transformed both into something more realistic, more honest, and, ultimately more effective at serving the human needs that virtue was supposed to address. The prince who understood virtue's complexity and contradictions was better positioned to serve virtue's deeper purposes than the prince who maintained virtue's surface requirements while ignoring its consequences. The citizen who acknowledged moral life's tragic dimensions was better equipped to make genuinely moral choices than the citizen who pursued moral purity while remaining blind to its costs. Machiavelli's dark insight thus offered not despair but a kind of moral realism that was both more demanding and more promising than traditional approaches to virtue. It was more demanding because it required taking responsibility for consequences as well as intentions, for social systems as well as individual choices, for the full complexity of moral life rather than its comfortable simplicities. It was more promising because it offered the possibility of moral choices that were genuinely responsive to human needs rather than abstractly committed to moral rules that might serve no one. The surprising consequences of virtue had revealed virtue's true nature not as a simple set of rules or character traits, but as an ongoing challenge to respond wisely, courageously, and responsibly to the full range of human needs and possibilities. This understanding of virtue was more difficult to grasp and more difficult to practice than traditional virtue, but it was also more honest and more effective at serving the ultimate purposes that made virtue valuable in the first place. As the evening shadows lengthened across Renaissance Florence, Machiavelli set down his quill and contemplated what he had discovered. The comfortable certainties of his youth had given way to a more complex but more truthful understanding of moral life. The virtue he had been taught to revere had proven more problematic than its teachers had acknowledged, but also more important than its critics had claimed. The surprising consequences of virtue had revealed not virtue's failure, but its true complexity, a complexity that demanded more rather than less from those who would serve virtue's authentic purposes. The insight was dark because it shattered illusions and demanded difficult choices. It was revolutionary because it challenged the foundations of moral and political thought. But it was also liberating because it offered the possibility of moral choices that were genuinely effective at serving human flourishing rather than merely effective at satisfying moral theories. In recognizing virtue's surprising consequences, Machiavelli had not destroyed virtue but revealed its true nature, and, in doing so, he had opened new possibilities for understanding and practicing virtue in a complex and often tragic world.